Hello, and welcome to the next episode of our podcast, AAC Access All Areas. I'm Ruth Jones.
And I'm Ali Batty. And today's question is, who might we use AAC with?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Yeah. And this, I think, this has really changed for me over the last few years. So I always used to think of non-speakers or children who had very unclear speech. So I would be thinking about sort of children with cerebral palsy or conditions that made their speech really effortful for them, or it might not be clear, so that unfamiliar people wouldn't be able to understand them. Um, and then also, I'm just thinking back to my time in a regional AAC hub where we would be assessing children. There would be children with Down syndrome sometimes if they had really
Mm.
unclear speech. And then we also had quite a lot of autistic children coming in. But I think we were quite unusual in the regional assessment hubs that we accepted a lot of autistic children. I don't think they all did at that time.
Mm.
But that scope has broadened, hasn't it?
Well, I think so. I'm definitely referring, autistic children into hubs or doing it via their NHS services and their school speech therapists. So I think they definitely, the criteria has widened, but I think ultimately, like we've spoken about before, isn't it, is the purpose of the hubs are kind of to meet those really quite complex
Mm.
AAC access needs, which for predominantly most of our autistic clients, or at least in my experience, is they're kind of able to access that more immediate, like we've got the device, we've got the app, or we've got the paper-based
Yeah.
system, and you're not necessarily thinking about more complex access arrangements to actually be able to use
Yes.
AAC tools. I think it's really interesting for me because my work has only ever been really with autistic clients and always very high support needs. So I've used AAC from the first day that I was working as a speech and language therapist, and it's just never stopped. But I think what's been really interesting for me is that more recently I've been working with children still in specialist provision, but arguably their language and communication skills would fall more in that medium low support needs
Mm.
category. So they've got
Yeah.
access to spoken language, they've got access to levels of understanding that enable them to, they're doing foundation levels, they're doing GCSEs. But what I'm also finding is they're the children who, when their nervous system goes into
Mm.
shutdown and we're experiencing that fight, flight, freeze form situation, AAC can be really helpful for them as well.
Yeah.
So I've spent many hours sat in corridors in schools with communication books or
Mm.
whiteboards or, things
Mm.
where we're using alternative communication tools in that moment because they don't have access to their spoken language. And that's the
Yeah.
bit for me that I've really kind of broadened, I suppose. Broadened as much as you can within the niche of only working with autistic people, really, but broadened it out, I guess, and thought about it in a more creative way, I suppose. And
Yes. Yes.
just because you're speaking, it doesn't mean you don't need extra
Yes,
help
and I
at
remember
times.
coming across this concept of a part-time AAC user only, probably only 3 or 4 years ago. I think it was like
Oh,
listening to a podcast and it was, an adult AAC user who had only just started using AAC. She had thought of herself as a speaker or a mouthwords user for most of her life, and then realised she might even have been a speech and language therapist supporting
mm,
AAC users. And then it kind of occurred to her that, hang on, there are times when my speech is really expensive in terms of
oh,
effort. So I really like this term of expensive speech. So there are times where it takes me so much of my effort to formulate speech and put words into meaningful phrases that express what's in my head. She realised that it was far easier for her to type at those times.
mm,
And so there were times of the day, maybe in a meeting where she really wanted to express complex ideas, that she would type. So she effectively became a part-time AAC user. And I think that's the first time I'd really heard of that concept, which seems silly now
mm.
that it took me so long. Um, but I think since realizing that that was a thing, it has made me think a lot about AAC. Is just another tool in the communication toolkit. Whereas I
Mm,
think previously it was almost thought of as a last resort
yeah.
when all else wasn't working. So a child's speech wasn't coming along, or the language wasn't coming along. And I should just, for the non-speech and language therapists out there, the difference between speech and language, speech is sort of the mechanics of what our mouths are doing and coordinating breath and voice, and then the articulators in the mouth. That's speech. That's sort of like the mechanical side. Whereas language happens at a brain level. So that is being able to access the right words, storing the words so that we get that sort of accurate word retrieval. It's putting words in the right order. So we can do that in our heads, but we might not be able to get it out as speech. So children can have a lot of
Mm,
language without having speech. Um, so I think it used to be viewed that AAC was for those children who had language in their heads, but their speech wasn't intelligible to other people, or they had no speech or minimal speech.
um,
Um, and that is still the case, that we still think about AAC for those people, but increasingly we're also thinking about children with minimal speech and children with unreliable speech as well.
yeah, definitely. And I think that's where it's just interesting. I've been having a few conversations lately and thinking a bit about what you said about it was kind of often thought about for children who we feel have language in their mind but can't use spoken language to get those thoughts out. And I think that's something that AAC is a really interesting and quite complicated concept, isn't it? Because I think now what we would say is that we must presume potential. We must either presume that they've got the
Mhm.
potential to show us the language that's in their mind, or potential to learn language through AAC that we can teach them. And I think that's often been a barrier to
Mm.
thinking about more robust, kind of bigger
Yes,
sets of AAC, lots of language in AAC. So people typically would think, oh, we'll start with a board with two symbols on, or just a single symbol
yes,
or a single
yes.
word, and we'll build it up. And so I think even for some of those individuals who we might consider to have quite complex kind of
Mhm.
cognitive impairment, learning disability, we have to kind of presume potential and offer them the
Yes.
opportunities, don't we, to access AAC. So where there's been this, you've got to kind of almost have so much frustration because you've got all these words in your
Mm,
head that
mm.
means you need AAC. Now I think we look at any individual who doesn't have access to communication tools outside of maybe their body language, their facial expressions and gestures, um, because so much about a person shows up communication in those non-verbals, doesn't it? Which is part of a
Yes.
toolkit and part of non-verbal communication and alternative communication methods. But what we know is that access to robust language is going to really bolster those kind of non-verbals that
Yes.
they're using,
Yes.
and we can model and teach. And I think for me, that's something that's really important, is that we don't just think about those children who, like you say, historically are the ones who we know has got words in their
Yes.
brains, but they're
And
struggling to get it out through speech.
I've never met a child who doesn't have internal
No,
language.
no,
Whereas
absolutely.
I think we were kind of trained to think that some children were non-verbal. So this is why I don't use the term non-verbal anymore.
Yeah.
And it really gives me the icks when I see or hear the term non-verbal now, because I don't think there is a child without language in their head. And even those children with the most complex needs
Mhm.
and severe, in inverted commas, learning
Yeah.
disabilities. I think all children have some language in their head, and so starting with like really, really simple, basic, limited language, like, giving them two symbols, more and stop or something, or
Yeah.
yeah, or crisps, or apple. Um, how frustrating would that be if
Yeah.
you only had that language available to you to
Mm.
express the complexity that is in a human being's mind?
Yeah, that's it. And the conversation I was having was with an AAC specialist teacher who actually I would love to get on to talk a bit more with one day, I think, on this space, 'cause I think they'd be incredible. But we were talking about the challenges with kind of diagnostic labels like PMLD, profound and
Mm,
multiple learning disabilities, or SLD, severe learning disabilities, is how is that tested? And what offer of communication tools are those individuals being
yeah.
enabled with in order to get that kind of label? And then ultimately they go into a PMLD class or an SLD class, and what offer of AAC is available there, and what kind of
Mm,
presuming of their competence and their potential is going on, um,
mm,
when it's kind of based on a diagnostic label where the diagnosis might not have included offering things like AAC that is robust and
mhm.
space to learn. And so I think there is something, isn't there, about that really presuming potential. And there will
Yes.
be individuals and children, there absolutely will, who you go in with the best belief, you offer robust AAC, and it just doesn't quite work in that way. So we do kind of maybe think about paring it down. We do think about making it a bit simpler. But, I really struggle with anyone who starts small and builds up, because I think
Mm.
that's not necessarily presuming potential. For me,
Yeah,
do it the other
yeah.
way. Start
And
with a
I
bit
would
more.
prefer to offer a robust vocabulary, as in an extensive vocabulary, but
Mm,
just the people around that child, maybe concentrating on a few different pages of that,
yeah,
but they've still got all of the language there. Because I do think once you get going with AAC, you might be thinking, oh, I'll just concentrate on these 6 pages first. So, it might
yeah,
be bubbles because that child loves bubbles, or it might be sensory toys. But very soon you realise, oh, hang on, I need some action words. I
yeah,
need I need go and stop. Um, or bounce or spin. So very quickly you realise that you need to go beyond 8 pages
yeah, yeah,
of language for, I think, for any child. And if it is a sort of slower rate of take up, that's fine. If
yeah,
if in the first 3 months we are just concentrating on 6 to 8 pages, that's fine.
yeah,
But we do want to have those other pages available because children surprise us all the time,
yeah.
in what they want to talk about and what they find interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's, I can't remember. I think there was a speech therapist. Was it Destination Communication? Might have been on Instagram, that shared a post about like AAC, and they were talking about after 6 months, I think, like a child had sort of initiated or pointed to something on their AAC. And in fact, Ellen shared today, Ellen Martin, EM speech therapy, about like offering modeling for a session, and then at the end the child. And I think that's the thing, isn't it, is when we're thinking about who are we delivering AAC with, that if you've got an idea in your head and you presume potential but it's not happening too quickly, it doesn't mean they're the wrong candidate for it. It might just mean
Yes.
that teaching and that learning process takes time. And so I
Yeah.
think sometimes what we have to remember is it doesn't necessarily mean it's the wrong tool for the person. It
Mm.
might just mean that their learning, like you say, is slightly slower. And the more we
Yes.
champion sticking at it with AAC,
Yes.
the better. Because I think there's
Yes.
a misconception, isn't there, that those people who are right for AAC are the people who you give a device and within a week they're typing and
Mm. Mm,
giving
mm.
long complex
And
sentences
and
and
there are
telling
some
stories.
children that take to it
Yeah,
immediately and start exploring it immediately, but there are more children who we have to just continue to lightly model. And I think sometimes children have been put off visual supports or
yeah,
AAC because it's been prompted so much. So
mhm,
they might, the classic situation would be during the hello time in the morning, that they've all got like a shared visual, that they all have to say, good morning, I'm feeling, and it's sort of the expectation that they have to say, I'm feeling happy. And then they go through the weather and the day of the week.
yeah,
And that's all quite boring, isn't it? Like, if I could get rid of one thing in
yeah,
schools, I think it would be that really heavily prompted repetitive hello time. Because by the
yeah,
third year of doing that, children probably are pretty fed up. I was going to say something ruder, and
Yeah.
I won't. But those children, I think, sometimes can almost be a bit traumatized by
Yeah.
visuals and symbols. So another situation would be if they only use it at snack time to choose their snack. So it's really boring, and it could potentially be really insulting to
Mm.
a child who has a lot more language and a lot more interesting things to say. I always say lightly model it through fun activities first,
Oh,
um, because we just want, a light scattering of that AAC language alongside spoken language, and all the other things that we're doing to support communication, so that it's not seen as this is the only thing that people want
mm.
from me. And I have to do it in the way they want me to do it. So it's very prescribed. What I would much prefer to see is that it's very open and creative, and the child can kind of do what they like with it, and surprise us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've almost kind of it's almost a bit summarized that fully, hasn't it? Like actually, who's the right person for AAC? As long as you presume potential, anyone
Mm,
really has capacity to give
mm,
AAC a go.
yes.
And then it is about not giving up, recognizing what is meaningful and what is fun, and ultimately considering their previous experiences. I've definitely
Mhm.
worked with so many kiddos where we've tried to introduce AAC and you're undoing an awful lot, particularly if you're picking them up maybe when they're 10, 11, 12. You're
Yes.
undoing an awful lot of harm that they've
Yeah.
experienced through pressurized communication, through
Mhm.
expected responses, through rights and wrongs. So they've failed
Yeah.
inverted commas on communicating because they've not pointed to the right symbol that's linked to
Mm,
the lesson or link, and so you kind of having to unpick and offer them space to be authentic in their communication. And so I think there is
yes.
something about when you're not seeing progress in inverted commas, because there's always these little glimmers, but that progress is
Mhm.
as you might see some children, like you say, who just pick it up and roll with it. For those who don't stop, because actually there's so many factors that could be influencing them as an individual in terms of,
Yeah.
that apparent slower uptake of AAC. So I think
Yeah.
who is it for? It's for everyone, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's not. I think it's widened in the field of speech and language therapy, because I've seen AAC introduced, say, for a child who has situational mutism. So they might be
Mm,
comfortable using their voice in some situations, but some situations they're quite phobic about using their voice, and AAC can be a less scary way
yeah,
of using language. Um, I've also, at the moment, I'm supporting a child who has developmental language disorder. Um, it's one of those children that I wasn't quite sure, is this developmental language disorder, as in a very
yeah,
specific difficulty with language, but the rest of their development is sort of coming along with as expected from those dreadful developmental norms, which I don't trust anymore. Um, and then I was also thinking, but is there some sort of neurodivergence, or there were lots of questions in my mind. So we introduced AAC on an iPad, um, and his language is now progressing beautifully. Like it's been astonishing. So vocabulary has exploded after I would say, a really slow start of lots of support, but not much progress. But then all of a sudden, it just exploded, and it did sort of coincide with introducing the AAC. Um, but
mm,
I would say he's definitely a mouth word user predominantly,
yeah,
but just very occasionally he'll draw on his iPad. He uses Supercore 50 if he doesn't know the word for something. So he almost uses it as a dictionary or a thesaurus
mm,
to pull out. So I think that there was an example of a fruit, and he didn't know the name of a fruit, but he managed to go into Supercore 50 and find it there and say
yeah,
pineapple. Um, and so I increasingly also think of AAC as potentially it can be a dictionary, it can be a thesaurus, it can be a kind of phrase book as well for
yeah,
Gestalt language processors.
yeah.
So just, those language resources that we all use,
Yeah. I
and
think that's it,
AAC.
isn't it? Like, yeah, we do. I often talk about it in training I'll deliver on AAC is who, when you're struggling to find the words, would send like a little video meme or a GIF or a
Mm,
symbol. Like we all kind of have those moments where we might struggle to find the words and we use our non-verbals, our facial expressions or our body language, or we do like lean into technology. And I think it's kind of affording everybody else that same opportunity. There's something in there, isn't
mm,
there, about adults' perceptions that children should just be able to do something with their language in that moment, particularly if they are speaking most of the time, that then when it's not there,
mhm,
it's like, well, just, use your words, the dreaded phrase,
mm,
and, kind of
mm,
you think, well, actually, if they could, they would, because that would make life a lot easier. So if they're not, they can't, and therefore thinking about AAC. And I think there's something there, isn't there, that for those children, perhaps they're in a setting where AAC isn't part of the everyday practice. Whereas, like in some schools you go into, and actually, if they've got quite a broad range of needs, there's symbols and words everywhere. The team are very well versed in AAC tools and kind of have ideas about AAC. But actually, if you're in a setting where that isn't so common, that's quite a big thing to even think
mm,
about, to even think, oh, well, why don't
oh,
we give them
mm,
something else to communicate with? So
mm,
I've got a few where we've worked on within safeguarding parameters of schools and phones and that sort of thing, but actually been able to use like a notes app just to type things
mm,
out. So if the language is a bit much in that moment, particularly in like a lesson, they could just type something,
mm,
if a child's, and it's often this misconception that, well, when they're having a chat with their friends or a chat with their TA, they can be really chatty. And I'm like, yeah, because there's no pressure. They're talking about something that they're
mm,
enjoying. Their nervous system's really regulated. But if you put them in a classroom in a
yeah,
situation where you're asking them a question and they don't answer, doesn't necessarily mean that they don't understand the question. It's that they can't physically structure that answer in the moment.
yeah,
And so I think there is something about validating that experience, isn't there, for children who do struggle to access their spoken words at times and
mm.
the perception around
Yes,
them
and I
and
and
kind
I
of
think
their
it's
worthy.
interesting. Yeah, it's also interesting to think about universal design. So,
Mm,
for anybody who isn't familiar with that term, universal design is designing our spaces, and that might be schools, or it might be the workplace, or anywhere where human beings are really, designing those spaces to accommodate everyone's needs, particularly thinking about disability. So, like ideally, the universal design of a classroom would include visual supports and AAC resources just around, and it would be perfectly acceptable for children to type if their handwriting is really difficult, or to have a little whiteboard to be able to write things
mm,
down, and for the adults to be using those modalities as well. We are a society that very much has prioritised speech, and we
mhm,
see this all the time, don't we, Ruth, in our practice, that even though a child is now beautifully using their AAC. They've got a really wide vocabulary with their AAC. They're making phrases now. I do frequently, and I recognise this longing from parents, like that they will say, can we work on speech a little bit? Do you think they are able to talk? And I get, if you're a parent, you desperately do want your child to have easy access to speech. But I also wonder whether that's something about society's pressure that speech is better
yeah,
than AAC language. So I think we've got a lot of work to do there around ableism in our society, that we don't see speech as being superior.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the crux of challenges with AAC, isn't it? Is kind of that perception of it, and that it's sort of held, like you say, it's not about equitable communication access. It's actually that
Mm.
speech is still held in higher esteem, which is crazy in a world where everyone would rather send an email than have a phone call. But
Isn't
it's
it? That's so interesting, isn't it? Because I would rather send a text message than have a phone conversation. So I don't
oh,
know whether
every
this
day.
was, I was a very, very shy child, and I remember feeling I just couldn't physically talk in front of adults. I very much remember that
Mm,
feeling, which might be why I became a speech and language therapist. And it was in the 70s, in the days where, my mum used used to wear a really long skirt, so I would hide under her skirt. That was like my
Yeah.
tent of safety. Before we had
Yeah.
sensory tents for children to withdraw to, children were using their mum's skirts to hide. Um, so I do remember that feeling of just like, it's too much to talk.
Yeah.
Like, that is just really uncomfortable. And I do think that that's probably quite prevalent in
Mm.
children with unreliable speech, but also when you pull in apraxia of speech as well. And I
Yeah.
think it's been estimated that a third of autistic children have some degree of apraxia, or dyspraxia, which means they struggle to access speech. Like, the mechanics of speech just do not come easily. There's varying degrees of it, from those children who are completely silent and can't access their voice at all, to children who can access their voice sometimes, maybe when they're running and jumping around, or they're doing something utterly delightful like being tickled. They might be able to access their voice and giggle or squeal. To those children who can produce sound but not produce accurate speech
Mm.
sounds. They might be able to do vowel sounds but not consonants. And then, those children who do have speech but it's very unclear, they can't
Mm.
sequence the sounds for connected speech. So I think we've got a better understanding of that than we used to have, that for a
Mm.
lot of autistic children, it's not cognitive, for cognitive reasons that they're not talking, but rather it is their speech coordination problems that prevent
Mm.
them from talking.
Which is why it's even more important to presume potential, isn't it? Because if it's a
Mm, mm.
motor planning, getting everything in the right place challenge, and the therapy for apraxia is incredibly intense and requires an awful lot
Yeah,
of input, that
yeah,
actually if they're not able to access that level of therapy, or they're not ready to access that level of therapy, then AAC is foundational, isn't it? Because it gives them
mm,
access to all those words that could well be in their head, but kind of often historically that presumption has been that non-speaking almost does mean non-thinking. And
yes,
it's that
absolutely,
age
yeah,
old thing, isn't it? It doesn't mean just because I'm not speaking doesn't mean I'm not hearing, doesn't mean I'm not
yes.
processing, doesn't mean I'm not thinking.
Yeah.
So yeah, I
I
think
always remember, there's an AAC user that I follow on Instagram called Danny with Words, and
yeah.
I think he said on a podcast that his sort of tagline on his email um is non-speaking but very verbal, as in, he struggles with speech, but he's got a lot of language in his head, and he's very articulate, and I love that. Non-speaking but highly verbal. I'd like to put that on a t-shirt for children to wear.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, it's fab. And I think actually we should probably use this as a moment to just plug following AAC users. If you are a
Mm.
parent or a speech therapist, or you are an educator, anybody who's kind of interested in AAC, there are some brilliant accounts of AAC users. So have a little follow along and have a little look at those, because they can be really insightful, can't they, into what's worked with AAC and particularly people with problems.
Yeah, I've learnt more from those people than,
Mm.
other speech and language therapists or AAC experts, and definitely I've had more unlearning through
Mm.
engaging with that learning from AAC users. I think we've plugged it before, but there's a brilliant Facebook group called Ask Me.
Yeah.
I'm an AAC user. Um, and if I've got any thoughts or questions, that would be my first port of call, because they
Yeah.
have that lived experience. Yes, it's their individual opinion, so take that into account. But who better to sort of advise on real life AAC than an AAC user?
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, so we decided, didn't we, that we're going to like finish off each episode now with a
Mm.
little glimmer, something exciting that's
Yeah.
happened to us since the last recording. And you were excited before we came on to record. You obviously had something you were really want to share, and I'm excited to hear because I didn't want to know. I thought I'll listen to it
Yes.
as we're recording. So what's been going on?
Yes, yes. So I was in a school this morning, and this is a student that I've been working with for some time. This would be such a good example of presumed potential, because this is a student that wouldn't have met any of those NHS England criteria hub for referral when I first started working with her. So we just tried it out, and I didn't know whether it would work or not. It did. She now knows her VocoChat package absolutely inside out. She is so whizzy with it. So we've been moving on to really focusing on literacy, I would say, for the last 6 months, and doing all sorts of things literacy wise. Um, Phonics really wasn't working for her. Like, she just wasn't interested in phonics. So we did a sort of like whole word approach, and we really focused on people's names because she's so sociable and absolutely loves people's names. So we kind of did a word to photo matching thing. That was her first way into reading. And I've been wanting to get her typing for a long time, but not very much interest from her in that, so I haven't pushed it. But today we were playing a game where she's just started sort of doing pretend writing, where children are like scribbling, but you can see it's supposed to be writing because it's like squiggled long lines. And so I was very excited when I saw that. So we were playing a game today where we were writing a shopping list for mummy, like what does mummy need from the shops? And then she was writing, I say milk. She was finding milk on her talker just spontaneously. She didn't have to do that. And then she was writing it down with her squiggle. And so we did that for a while. And then I said, shall we plan a party and decide who we're going to invite? Because I know she loves people's names. And she said the name of the person that she first wanted to invite. And so I just said to her, shall we try typing it? And she was up for it today. So she copy typed from me writing that person's name. I supported her to copy type it. So she needs some help to find the right letters and to recognise that handwritten letter E is the same as the E
Mm.
on the keyboard. So I was very much supporting that because I'm trying to make it a fun thing that she is not feeling she's failing with. Anyway, she typed, I think, 6 or 7 names of friends today. And she didn't want to stop. It got to the end of our session. I was like, oh God, we need to stop soon. Or we needed to stop 5 minutes ago. I don't want to stop. So that was just like such a joyful moment because I think that is her intro into typing now. She knows where the keyboard is on her VocoChat. So I'm just really excited. The start of a lovely literacy journey, I think.
Oh my gosh, that sounds so exciting. So exciting, isn't it? It's just incredible, isn't it? Those moments of, yeah, those little light bulb moments where you feel like something just shifted in a
Yes.
communication profile, something just shifted. I
Yeah.
wasn't sure what I was going to share, but now I feel like I'm thinking about a typer that
Yeah.
I'm working with, and it's a young person. They had Supercore 30 when I first met them, and within a session I was like, has anyone explored increasing the vocab access here? So we're
Mm.
now on Supercore 50, and an incredible user in terms of navigating. You have to show them once the pathway, and then they remember the pathway, they can get back into whatever it is. And they definitely have an interest in typing. It's something that has been talked about historically before I started working with them, that their parents have mentioned. And so I was like, okay, like I'm still getting to know them, to be honest. I've been working with them for a while, but if you're only going in half an hour a week in term time, it takes a long time. um and it was actually the session just before Christmas, and I'd navigated on their grid to time and then celebrations to say like, oh, I've got to go now, but happy Christmas. And they took
Yeah.
I share their device if I'm modeling, took it like,
Mm.
Christmas, wow. And they said Christmas decoration, but then in the bottom is hyphen S to make it a plural. And they pressed the S to make
Oh.
decoration the plural for Christmas decorations. And I was like, ah, this is so exciting because that's the beginning of some literacy, some grammar coming, isn't it? That you're kind of
Mm.
turning that singular into a plural.
Yes.
And actually, over the Christmas break, their parents sent a video of them at home typing it out and then adding ES for princess us
Oh,
to make
wow.
it. I know.
Yeah. Brilliant. Oh,
So
it's so exciting.
really, really exciting. So I'm going to have to brush up on my literacy skills because that is not my clinical strong point. But they, I'm sure, will come along on the
Well,
journey
I
with
think they
me, and
find it
we'll explore it
hilarious if we
together.
can't spell things, Ruth. Once worked with a child, and in our first session, he was drawing animals, and then they were getting more and more difficult to spell, and it was absolutely hilarious that I couldn't spell orangutans. I really had to like struggle to spell orangutan. So sometimes it can be good for children to see us struggle with our spelling as well,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
that's what they're experiencing.
Yeah, it would be fine apart from the one word that I seem to struggle with the most is language. I
Oh,
can
me
never
too.
get the
I
U
can't
and the
type
L.
language. Yeah, no, I've never typed that correctly.
No, every time it comes up with a red line, I'm like, "Oh gosh." So yeah, on that bombshell that neither of us can spell the word language, we will round off this episode, which has been brilliant. Thank you everyone for listening, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. Bye bye.